What's up, everybody? It's the Digital World Podcast, and I think this thread is really good from Raul Paul, and I want to go ahead and read it and talk about it. And he was referring to the interview that Gensler had, and he says it's clear he is laying down the hardest case he can for regulation of digital assets. But my view is that he'll likely get his way, that most are going to be classified as securities, but with a wholesale change to what that means. Okay, so essentially he's saying they'll be classified as securities, but how it's identified on the wholesale side of that will vastly differ from what we understand it today. It's like then the internet started to gain real traction. The authorities tried to impose harsh rules, but in the end there had to be a grand compromise to not stifle something very important. That decision led to trillions of dollars of new capital creation and the largest investment inflows into the U.S. And that innovation that was seeded from light touch regulation of the internet changed the world with the U.S. as a leader. So when you allow innovation and you foster it, and you don't try to regulate it through enforcement, you see flourishment, you see good things. Now he says digital assets are as big a deal. This technology has created an entirely new financial system, more robust than the last, and created entirely new business models on a scale we are all trying to get our heads around as it's developing so fast. Digital assets might well be securities, but the regulation around that will end up being much lighter touch than today. If they try the heavy hand, capital leaves, and also the lobbying power of the crypto community is growing every day. And money talks, which he's correct in saying that. The reason no one wants to call something a security is that it comes with a huge burden and cost, time, and access to regular investors. But pair that all back to create innovators regulation and layer in KYC, tax compliance, and some investor protection, and it's a good thing. Okay, so if you can create all these ways to create a sandbox for it and know how to tax it and be able to protect investors in certain situations, well, now you have a viable business model. Or I don't know if it's a business model, but you have a viable way of making this something that that can be tracked or regulated in a way. I think that's what he's trying to get at. Here he says, and that also means the frankly ridiculous rules around accredited investors or selling securities has to change to meet the modern world, not the 1930s. It's simply inexcusable to allow rich people to get richer and penalizing the poorer people who aren't accredited. This is an interesting thought because based on the system we have, everything keeps going up and up and up, right? But then those people who are poor and are falling behind, it's making it harder for them to become accredited investors and be able to move up in the world. And it's creating that wealth gap more and more and more. And so that's what this system has designed. And if you see today, for example, homes, you live in one of these major cities, the housing costs are just out of the roof. Like, it's insane. And someone who makes a decent living can't even afford it. Even if you make, 70 to 100K, you can't. It's hard to buy one of these houses when they're $1 million for a normal house. It's just, and rent is just out through the roof. And this is the results of what these central banks have been doing. Okay, and they've just been inflating away, and your currency is diminishing. So you work more for less, and so they don't let the whole idea of free market capitalism take place, especially with what happened in 2008, where you're bailing out and you're choosing winners and losers. I mean, and this happened in the 70s too. Don't think it hasn't been happening in the 70s and 80s, where you're bailing out certain companies, certain businesses, and keeping them afloat, certain banks. You're choosing winners and losers, and you can't do that because then you create this system and people think, oh, it's capitalism that's wrong. No, it's not. It's the players who are choosing winners and losers and not letting businesses fail. That's the issue. He says, in a world of decades where real wages have remained stagnant and rising asset prices, that is morally wrong. That very dynamic has pushed U.S. households to rack up more debts than in all of history. And this is the very bad part, because when push comes to shove, people will be willing to accept giving up all their freedoms in order to be debt free and not owning anything and being happy, like the World Economic Forum says. That's why I think this has come, the game plan is nearing the end, and where you see a lot of people are in a lot of debt. And in order to get rid of all that debt, well, how are you going to do it? If you get it forgiven, then you're going to have to be willing to give up something, right? There's no free lunch, folks. What is more risky, the debt or the digital assets? We know the debt is what makes the banks rich too, because they earn interest off of that. And so they're accumulating that, and that's why they're making money, and they like that. And that's fractional reserve banking for you. The political pushback for stopping ordinary people access to investments just won't work in the current political climate, and nor should it. Newer crowdfunding rules have been shown the way, and the legal changes to run some of that has helped, but the current legal system generally forces individuals to use large financial institutions to get access to investments, keeping the power in these institutions' hands. This is unlikely to survive as a structure, as it inherently unfair, and trust in institutions is entirely eroded. The menace of all this is that people, well, before I finish that, I almost disagree with this statement here. He says the current system still generally forces individuals to use large financial institutions to get access to investments, keeping the power in these institutions' hands. This is unlikely to survive as a structure, as it's inherently unfair, and trust in institutions is entirely eroded. So it's not that and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he might be referring to how now with the blockchain, it's a decentralized a sort of technology where not one entity controls all of it. Okay, and right now we have centralized systems. Now we could see a shift where we move to a decentralized system where not one entity controls it. However, I do believe that does not mean that we're going to be better off. Case in point, CBDCs. They're coming. It's just a matter of when. Okay? But in order to have those CBDCs, you're using this blockchain system. Now, like we said, maybe we don't see these centralized controls of power, or maybe we do. I don't know. But we're using decentralized technology, and I think that at the end of the day, the gatekeepers to the economy will control it in a way that will curtail a lot of your freedoms, whether it's because it's all up to the regulators and to all these people in power and making the laws. And so I think, we may shift from a centralized power to a decentralized power when it comes to finances and economics, but that does not mean that the gatekeepers are not going to regulate and put laws in place to manipulate this. Okay, so there's a difference. There's a fine difference in that, in which you're moving from a centralized system to a decentralized system. But the people who remain in power will most likely be these central banks. And that's just a thought, because how do you control money? Well, you're going to have to be able to spend it, but who's in control of all that? Well, it's the banking system. Okay? Unless people decide to trade different goods on their own. But, I mean, what's the likelihood of that in today's day and age? So it's something to think about. I hope I made myself clear in explaining what I think. But anyways, he says, my view is in the end, he says, the madness of this is that people are free to bet on sports or throw all their money away in Vegas, but can't buy securities. They can lose money in any number of unregulated private transactions, which he has a point there. My view is that in the end, we'll get new security laws for digital assets, and they'll be cheaper, faster, fairer, and much less onerous on issuers. Consumer protection will have to come via warnings or some sort of risk metrics. He says this is going to take years. And, there's a lot of things that need to be figured out. There'll be regulation arbitrage in different jurisdictions if required. But regulation is coming globally, and countries that actively encourage these entrepreneurs with lighter regulation will take the lion's share of the benefits. And, he goes on. The rest that you can read for yourself. But I think that a lot of what's happening, to me, this is my opinion, is that they're obviously making a push where people don't want these centralized banks or institutions to hold all the power that control when and where you can invest. And so people are going to be like, no, let's go to the blockchain, which is decentralized, not one entity controls it. And that's a good way to sway them towards that. But at the end of the day, these central banks will slowly but surely creep their way in. And they're going to introduce CBDCs at one point or another. And there will be the way of, you'll have more privacy. Like in my last video, they'll make the whole argument of you'll have more privacy. It'll be more secure, more, you won't have to worry about fraud and whatnot, and it's on the blockchain. However, at the end of the day, they're the ones who are monitoring and controlling the whole system. It may be decentralized and on the blockchain, but that does not mean the gatekeepers don't have a way of regulating it. So that's my thoughts for the day. What are your thoughts? I hope this episode has brought you some value. Like and subscribe. Comment below. Let me know what you think of what's going to happen. We're in a very volatile state, but it's interesting to just get some ideas. This is the Digital World Podcast, and I'll see you in the next episode.